Right, welcome back again to our Lunchtime lecture series. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Everson, who's honorary lecturer at the University of Kiel, with which he's been associated since he was sent there to set up and run a local office of the now defunct Royal Commission on the Historical Monuments of England in 1984. It's not his fault it's defunct. He spent his working life in the State Archaeological Service, first as an archaeological investigator with the RCHME, and then with the English Heritage when the two agencies were assimilated, and was employed through the University of Nottingham when he worked for the RCHME in Lincolnshire before moving to Kiel. So he has a strong local connection as well. And he and his partner in crime, David Stocker, are the authors of the Lincolnshire and the recently published Nottinghamshire volumes of the Corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture. And today he's going to be introducing us to some elements from that. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me is always the first thing to ask. Good. Thank you for coming this lunchtime. I hope you'll find something interesting in what follows to repay your time. I'm an archaeologist with a number of specialist interests, some of them lying quite outside my subject today. But my longest running and most persistent thread of research work has been the study of early medieval stone sculpture, and my longest standing research partnership, now extending over 30 years, has been with my friend David Stocker. We've never in that period not had some piece of work in hand about this type of material. So anything I say today is said on David's behalf. On a different day, it might have been him standing here addressing you. Action. As archaeologists, we typically pursue our research through fieldwork to find physical or artifactual evidence and to record it systematically. So some images of Everson and Stocker frolicking in fields or in churchyards. In this context, that involves us visiting all churches and ancient church sites in our current study area and combing them for relevant items. Some have been previously noted, others are wholly new discoveries, and there's always a buzz in doing that. I sometimes think that there's an unspoken contest as we look around a church. David and I are vying with each other to find something new. Almost invariably, such items have gone through stages of reuse, as the slide on the screen indicates. One as a threshold stone, one as a common stone in a church wall, and the cross shaft on the right has sort of moved about a bit within the parish, and it's ended up in the churchyard there. Very frequently, as you'll see, we are dealing with mere fragments, where the original has been cut up and recycled into later phases of church fabric. As in all forms of archaeology, fieldwork and discovery are fun, but our efforts are not random. They have contributed and are still contributing to the long-term goal of creating a corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture in England. This national scholarly endeavour has been sponsored by the British Academy and organised by Professor Rosemary Cramp at Durham. That's her presiding over the enterprise in her typically kindly way on the screen there. It has produced a shelf full of weighty publications, on two of which are our names, and there will be a third when we finish our current fieldwork in Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire and produce volume 15 in the series. It's typical of our East Midlands region that both the cover images here are of Viking age monuments. On the Lincolnshire volume, we chose to have a bull's head motif from a class of recumbent grave covers that we call mid-Castevan covers. On the Nottinghamshire volume, it's one face of the shaft at Shelford. You'll hear more about both of these as I proceed, But it reminds me to say that across England, the balance of numbers between surviving pre-Viking and Viking era stone monuments of the type we study is, well, it's certainly no less than 1 to 4. It might be 1 to 6, 1 to 8, in favour of the later period. There's a massive upsurge in the creation of stone monuments in the later pre-conquest period. As you can see, the national map is almost completely filled in. And as that long-running process draws to a close, major resources are going into making the whole thing available online through a site hosted by the Archaeological Data Service at York. So all this stuff will become really easy to access for anyone interested. But gathering and recording and corpusing is not enough. What does all this tell us? What light does it throw, for today's purposes, on the Viking Age or the Anglo-Scandinavian era, as the modern archaeological discourse tends to call it, in the East Midlands? Well, perhaps we need some framework of dates and significant events. Perhaps with this audience we don't, because I understand most of you have attended all the previous lectures. Anyway, I thought we needed a framework of dates. So I've put the framework up there. In the 860s and 70s, the Viking armies, formerly a raiding and looting force, take land and settle in East Anglia, in the East Midlands and in Northumbria. The Danelaw, the area of England where Danish rather than English law should pertain, is formally agreed by the Treaty of Wedmore between Alfred and Guthrum. In the period 876 to about 918, the Viking kingdom of York flourishes, embracing the continuing Christian presence of the Archbishop there. In the 920s and 930s, there's fluctuating political control of the Northern Danelaw, our East Midlands, with Edward the Elder establishing English burghs at Nottingham and Stamford. 942 sees a decisive reconquest of the Northern Danelaw, including Lincoln and Nottingham, and in 953 a bishopric of Lindsey, which there had been in the pre-Viking period, in North Lincolnshire is re-established, probably with its see at Lincoln. 954 sees the English reconquest of York, and 956 a grant to the Archbishop of York of the massive estate at Southwell by the Kings of Wessex, and that links Nottinghamshire firmly to the Archdiocese of York. And then 1066, Norman conquest, of course, and William's harrying of the north, and in 1072, the relocation of the huge Midlands diocese from Dorchester-on-Thames to Lincoln, and the consolidation of that division between Lincolnshire in the southern province and Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire and so on in the northern province of the church. That's probably enough, since, as you'll soon realise, we cannot normally date the archaeological evidence, the artefactual evidence that I'm talking about, more closely than by half a century, plus or minus 25 years, as in, early 10th century and so on. It hardly needs saying, probably, that we struggle to see the impact of the Norman conquest on this material. And this is, in the past, given rise to what I think is a rather unhelpful concept in describing some of the stone sculpture as belonging to, quote, the overlap period. Overlapping, that is, the conquest. As applied, for example, to numbers of western towers added to local churches in the East Midlands and to their decorative details. And I'm illustrating examples in Nottinghamshire and particularly in Lincoln. It's been applied, I can say as an aside, quite wrongly, I think, as David and I have demonstrated in one of our better pieces of work, which we called Summoning St Michael, because we demonstrated that the building of these towers was to do with an introduction of or an emphasis on a burial practice involving the towers and the bells, which summoned St Michael to the burial. These towers date roughly to the half century between 1080 and 1130, so they lie out with our talk today. So where and how do we see Viking Scandinavians in the stone sculpture? Initially, at the end of the 9th century and into the early 10th century, in individual surviving pieces of sculpture. There are examples of this in northern Lincolnshire, at Crowle in the Isle of Axholme, and at Holton-le-Clay near Grimsby. At Crowle, there's a cross shaft, which you see on the screen, on which you see a combat scene, a hero or warrior on horseback. They're secular scenes as found on Northumbrian Viking sculpture, and they perhaps act out scenes from a Viking saga, such as the story of Sigurd. There's also a runic inscription. The language is Old English rather than Old Norse, the form of the runes Anglo-Saxon rather than Scandinavian, but the laying out of a runic inscription on a curved or arched band is best paralleled in Denmark or Jutland. The only legible word seems to mean corpse monument, i.e. grave marker, gravestone. Perhaps it's the gravestone of an individual newly settled Viking lord. At Holton-le-Clay on the right, there's a fragmentary part of a grave cover decorated with serpentine interlaced animals and manufactured in or near York. Identical covers were excavated in a cemetery beneath the south transept of York Minster, as the slide shows. Furthermore, both these monuments are fashioned from blocks of millstone grit, which was extensively used in Roman York. So these monuments recycled mason stone from that city and imply the transport of that stone into northern Lincolnshire. And it's used in church buildings. You can go round and see quite a bit of it in church buildings in that area. Perhaps also of this period, i.e. perhaps of the first half of the 10th century, are a pair of large flat grave covers we know of from Lincoln in one case and from Hackthorne in the other. They're both best depicted by drawings made of them. In the case of the Lincoln example, because it no longer we can't find it, this is the only evidence we have of this monument that you see on the screen there. And in the case of the Hackthorne piece, because it's been left lying outside in the weather and the surface has almost completely weathered away. So the drawing, a 19th century drawing, is key evidence. They are decoratively extremely similar. Style critically, their decoration belongs to the period before 950. It's in the Scandinavian Bora style. They seem to have been manufactured in Lincoln rather than, for instance, shipped in from the Viking Kingdom of York as the previous items, since they are fashioned from limestone of the distinctive sort that comes from the outcrops in the Lincoln Gap. Just possibly, they too were Roman stone recycled, which is a process we can occasionally see in surviving pieces from Lincoln. For example, in the case of the grave marker, which I've put on the slide here, which has a prominent Lewis hole from its Roman use. In Nottinghamshire, we find comparably distinctive and individual pieces, plausibly belonging to the early 10th century. Belonging to an early stage in that period is the intriguing shaft at Shelford. It features figures under arches on front and rear faces, a virgin and child on one side, and what has conventionally been called an angel on the rear. Most simply, it bears close comparison with the Viking Age with some Viking age shafts in the vicinity of York, at Nunburnham, which is on the screen, and Sutton on Derwent, for instance. Scholars have also found in the angel's supposedly out-of-scale left hand, raised in blessing, and in an example of crudity of execution, supposedly typical of Viking art. But you will notice that the angel has 4 clearly depicted wings, and it's actually rather well carved, but it has 4 clearly depicted wings. That means it is no ordinary angel, who ought not to be raising a hand in blessing anyway, and certainly not the left hand. So it's not an ordinary angel, but a cherubim, one of the Old Testament figures who in tradition guarded the Ark of the Covenant and the presence of Yahweh in the temple in Jerusalem. You get this differentiation of angels in other examples. I put one in on the bottom right there just to show you that you do get four-winged angels put up. There's one at Durham there. The Old Testament prophet Ezekiel recounts his vision of Yahweh abandoning the temple, borne by the cherubim, at a time of extreme crisis for the people of Israel. Under the impact of Babylonian invasions, the very sanctuary, the very temple, was given over to idolatry, the land more widely to heathens, and the leaders of the Israelites themselves acquiesced and cooperated. What the cherubim held in his hand here at Shelford was an image of Yahweh, the Old Testament Father, which has been targeted and smashed off by 16th century iconoclasm, leaving a scar that might be taken for an outsized hand. Suddenly we have here a monument that is at once very learnedly informed, with a structural balance on opposite faces between the Old Testament covenant and the new covenant of Christ, and at the same time an evocation of times in Jerusalem akin to those recently in England with Viking raids, chaos and destruction. In the Old Testament account, God had apparently quit the land, and perhaps in England too. But Yahweh in that account returned to his temple then, and perhaps the subtext here is that so too had or would the church in the Danelaw. This then, we might say, is not Viking age sculpture in the sense of being full of creatures in Scandinavian art styles. It is arguably more rarely and excitingly and interestingly contemporary sculpture that opens a window on the Viking age and the Christian church's responses to it. A fine cover at Hickling is another one-off. Though there remains debate about this judgment, it's perhaps best thought of as belonging to the early or mid-10th century, rather than alternatively to the age of Cnut a century later, which could be argued. It's a coped cover, but its Viking credentials are the end terminals in the shape of bears, which draw on the traditions of the so-called hogback covers of northern England, which are among the most distinctive markers of Scandinavian settlement there. But interestingly too, it is fashioned by reworking a block of yellowish millstone grit. We ourselves initially thought this was a limestone monument, but our geologist, when he came along with his little bottle of acid, demonstrated that it wasn't a limestone monument because it didn't fizz. And he correctly identified it as millstone grit, which was really interesting, and a sidelight on the fact that we work with geologists in this Corpus process, and their contribution is vital. So it's a reworking of a block of yellowish millstone grit, which was previously an attached half shaft on a major Roman public building. Such things occur on the outside of the Colosseum in Rome itself, or in this country, and from only recently excavated evidence of the spaced bases along the facade on the outside of the amphitheatre at Chester. The evidence for this origin lies in the setting still visible in one end of the Hickling monument for the cramp employed to fix it vertically to an adjacent wall stone. And the diagram top left tries to illustrate that. You can see in the photo of the end the hole where the iron cramp sat, and bottom right you can see the recently redisplayed amphitheatre at Chester with the bases along the facade on which there were half shafts ornamenting that. The evidence for this, it may be debatable whether such an item came south from York into Nottinghamshire or north from Leicester. They're the two most plausible sources. It's actually difficult to identify anything that might reasonably be called a Viking hogback in our East Midlands. Viking hogbacks in the middle of the slide in North Yorkshire. But we have plentiful evidence of large, heavy, chest-like grave covers designed to stand on the ground surface and to display decoration on three long faces in the way that hogbacks do. A part of a cover at Shelton, which has distinctive wheel-like end pieces, not bears in this case, but it has been discussed as part of a small group of disparately located, perhaps comparable items that were perhaps variants of or derived from hogbacks. A cover with a faceted top that David and I reconstructed from a heap of large fragments at Cranwell. Initially we did it actually physically in the church when we visited, and later on paper, is clearly a related monument. As too is a second cover of different but complex form at Shelton. Each of these is rather finely produced and rather elaborately decorated. Each, though, is fashioned in the limestone available from the quarries at Ancaster in central Lincolnshire. These complex items seem to be related, perhaps as bespoke one-off commissions or progenitors even, to the rectangular, horizontal, chest-like grave covers that we have called mid-Kesteven covers. They used to be described as cross shafts, the one that were known before we started, but they are in fact, every one that we've looked at, they are in fact recumbent covers. These two are decorated on their three long faces and are, without exception, produced in the distinctive fine limestone from Ancaster. A very fine, near-complete surviving example exists at Hawksworth in Nottinghamshire, stood up on end. People thought it was a cross shaft under the tower of the church there. Once the basic form of decoration and form of the monument is grasped, though the decoration varies considerably in its detailing, even quite small pieces can be recognised as from this category of grave cover, as shown here at Neasel, Wollaston and East Bridgeford, with the detail of this very nice bull's head motif that you get sometimes with really good detailing, sometimes rather crudely on these covers. We have at last count identified more than 50 examples of just this sort of massive grave cover, and there's a spread of them. They're quite impressive in bulk, as it were. With such numbers, one can look at such matters as production site and distribution from that production site, just as you can with all sorts of archaeological material. There's scarcely anything Viking about the decoration unless it lies in the little bull's heads. Nevertheless, we can argue that typologically there is a line of development from hogbacks to these frankly mass-produced items, and that in this form they belong to the later 10th and early 11th century. They are the East Midlands equivalent to those earlier monuments, tailored to the tastes of an assimilated Anglo-Saxon populace. We've also recorded a complementary occurrence of standardised flat grave covers decorated only on their top. They have a more restricted distribution, almost but not quite limited in Lindsey. These we've termed Lindsey covers. We're very original with our names. Lindsey covers. They, however, are produced in stone not from Ancaster but from the quarries at Lincoln, which were probably under the control from about 950 onwards of the restored Bishop of Lindsey, as they were later of the Bishop of Lincoln. There is absolutely nothing Viking in form or decoration about these. If they were painted, as they presumably were, since all this stone sculpture undoubtedly was painted originally, then a simple cross could be conjured out of the simple repetitive layout that you find. And I've illustrated that top right. Their decorative analogies lie in southern England, as indeed did the origins of the bishops as appointees of the Wessex kings of England. It's tempting to see these monuments as a tool in the bishop's promotion, reassertion and consolidation of Christianity in Lindsey. We might like to recall, however, that some leading families in Lindsey, as you'll recall from a previous distribution map, evidently chose to buy and deploy mid-Kestevan covers as the visible monuments of their dead, rather than the Bishop of Lindsey's distinctive type of monument. What were the semiotics of that? Did that choice, we might debate, in any way reflect a sense that the mid-Kestevan cover signalled a Scandinavian background, remembered and honoured, because of the historic link of this chest form to the northern hogbacks? It's a question. By the end of the 10th century, however, the picture from this stone sculpture is quite clearly of an assimilated population using a variety of quarry-produced memorials, some of them quite impressive and costly, but also quite standardised. We can illustrate that impression in other ways from this body of material. If you tabulate our Lincolnshire findings, in the countryside, we almost never identify more than one or two stone funerary monuments at any church site. And in some areas, there are a couple of maps there showing you, selected areas. In some areas, we find those findings in parish after parish, adjacent to each other. This suggests to us two things. First, that we are seeing in the occurrence of these monuments the foundation of graveyards and church sites and of parish formation in Lincolnshire, dated to the late 10th century by the occurrence, the incidents of these funerary monuments. And secondly, a little bit more of a jump perhaps, that the stone monuments may mark the actual foundation of those graveyards and their supporting parishes. They may mark the burials of the founding families. This sort of setup is precisely what was found in the excavation of a complete early church and cemetery at Raunds in Northamptonshire 15 or 20 years ago. Only one pair of stone grave markers in the whole of the graveyard excavated there, and they marked a sort of central core grave in the way that the graveyard was arranged. Contrariwise, in the towns, we sometimes find exceptional numbers of rather miscellaneous stone monuments at a single location, specifically at churches whose location shows that they served trading communities. The completely excavated site of St Mark's in Lincoln, in the suburb of Wigford, is a prime example. lots of stone monuments, lots of them rather limited in their aspirations. As is indicated by many categories of evidence, coins, pottery and so on, towns such as Lincoln mushroomed as commercial and trading centres in the later 10th century under the influence of Viking settlement, Viking entrepreneurial initiatives, Viking manufacturing skills, Viking trade links. In these communities, you get relatively large numbers of middling to well-to-do persons, merchants, marking their burials accordingly. We have dubbed this theme Monuments and Merchants and have explored it in different parts of late Saxon England. Most recently in a paper that we published about Chester. You might be interested. I've put Lincoln's river frontage and its churches here in a diagram on the left, the churches of St Mark and St Mary, both in Wickford. And Lincoln merchants took with them the same standardised grave monuments that we've been looking at, which identified their Lincolnshire origins when they allied themselves to trading communities in other boom towns in eastern England, which were linked by the waterways draining into the Wash, in Norwich and in Thetford, for example. And that's shown on the slide here. And the plan of those two towns with their waterfront trading areas and a service church immediately behind that waterfront are shown on these diagrams. As the conquest approached, we can trace too, from this body of sculptural material that we've catalogued, how the quarries of southern Lincolnshire and the Peterborough area produced and distributed new forms of similarly standardised products. Not only north and west into the northern Danelaw, but also throughout East Anglia, as far, presumably by coastal shipping, as London. They thereby set patterns of exploitation of raw materials and commercial distribution of funerary monuments that pertained very visibly throughout the High Middle Ages. By this date, then, occasional individual stone monuments may deploy stylish Viking Age art. The most famous, probably, is the slab from St Paul's Churchyard in London, which I illustrate bottom right, with its authentic Ringerike-style depiction of a hunt. Richard Bailey has called it the memorial of a Swedish member of King Knut's retinue. Its runic inscription is in Old Norse. They are Scandinavian runes. The names mentioned are Scandinavian names. It is a real one-off for an outsider. It may be an icon of Viking art in England, but there's nothing remotely so Viking in the contemporary East Midlands. In fact, I put that last slide together and wrote the supporting text that I've just read several weeks ago. Then, only a few days later, on fieldwork near Peterborough, David and I came across this remarkable sculpture at Glatton, within what we may, with a bit of license, call the East Midlands. It's a pagan Norse Viking image on what looks like a stone Christian cross shaft. It has the normal plain roll mouldings and it's recycled into the church fabric in a familiar manner for our material. Besides, presumably, paint to enliven an already lively image, it had metal or jewelled insets in the deeply drilled eyes and a horizontal metal inset in the mouth, which already sculpturally belches fire. These are not whiskers, I think they're fire coming out of the sculpture's mouth. It may be Surtr, the Norse fire giant, who was a major player on the day of Ragnarok, which saw the overthrow and destruction of the gods of Norse mythology, and from which emerges a new cleansed world to be ruled by innocent gods who have survived the Holocaust. This recalls the great cross at Gosforth, whose elaborate sculptural scheme features Odin, Vithar, Heimdallr, Loki, the Fenris wolf, and others in combat on the day of Ragnarok, but all of those on a Christian monument and alongside a depiction of the crucifixion. Such a fully Norse Viking theme at Glatton probably belonged to the early phase of Viking settlement in the 10th century. I think we will come to conclude, as the Gosforth cross did, when thematic similarities in ancient Norse myths were used as a bridge to acceptance of the primary concepts of the indigenous Christian faith. Finally, if I have time, I don't know if I have time, so I'm going to do it. Finally, I thought I'd share with you a serendipitous, recent, rather stunning discovery at Louth in East Lindsey. This is, again, to emphasise that you find things when you do fieldwork. It's amazing, archaeology. You actually find things, and sometimes they're absolutely thrilling. The discovery was of a ring-headed crosshead with an image of the crucified Christ surviving on it. It might raise questions, and it happened in the rectory garden at Louth in eastern Lincolnshire. It might raise questions similar to those I've touched on, and which other disciplines that you've been hearing about that study Viking settlement in England concern themselves with. And at the same time, it reinforces for modern scholarship how such material is not an esoteric collector's item to be judged only aesthetically or style critically, but if combined sensibly with other forms of evidence, can throw light on its contemporary society trends and developments. So there's the piece of stone being found with Stocker taking photographs, and there are technical photographs of the piece, every side of the piece of stone on the top left. Louth was one of the Bishop of Lindsey's manors, pre-conquest, where he promoted what by the time of Domesday Book was a sizable town and a valuable asset. The cross to which our crosshead belonged was, from its size and elaboration, a major public monument. It was fashioned in stone from the bishop's own quarries at Lincoln, 30 miles beyond the Wolds to the west. As David and I have proposed, this was the market cross erected by the bishop in establishing the market at Louth in the 950s or soon after. In making the cross ring-headed, you'll notice it's a ring-headed cross, a common form in Ireland, and then it went to taken to Viking northern England. The bishop was, one might argue, knowingly reaching out to the local population with its mixed Scandinavian heritage, who might identify with this northern fashion. They occupied settlements in the surrounding countryside named Bø and Thorpe, and often with Old Norse personal names identifying historic ownership. They named many fields and minor topographical features with Old Norse words. They brought commonplace words like window, crawl, odd, take from Old Norse into the common stock of English. Many themselves had Old Norse personal names. Here specifically, in Louth, they pronounced Louth in the Scandinavian fashion as it stayed, rather than Luda in English fashion. But they seized opportunities for economic betterment and personal advantage, and they expected their manufacturing and trading to operate within contemporary tenurial structures and to be sanctioned and legitimated by Christian symbolism and Christian oversight in the trading place. They were, in modern parlance, by the later 10th and 11th centuries, second, third or fourth generation English. They knew and honoured their origins, if they wished to, and were assimilated, some more, some less, into their host society. Or so the massive stone funerary monuments we've been looking at suggest. Thank you.